She stood still, surrounded by flames. The crowd roared, but her eyes were fixed on the sky. Joan of Arc, a girl of 19, was about to burn for hearing voices no one else could hear. She wasn't a queen. She wasn't a knight. She was a peasant who dared to claim God spoke to her. And for that, they tied her to a stake. The fire was already licking the wood. Yet she did not scream. This wasn't just an execution. It was a warning. A girl who challenged kings and priests, who led armies with nothing but a vision, was too dangerous to live. Her faith made her powerful, and power like that always burns. The marketplace in Rouen was a theater of death that day, May 30, 1431. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and fear. The crowd, a mix of jeering soldiers and silent townsfolk, watched as the executioner prepared the pyre. The wood was dry, stacked high to ensure the flames would rise fast. Joan stood bound, her simple dress torn, her hair cropped short to shame her. A paper crown, scrawled with the word heretic, sat mockingly on her head, but her face was calm. Not the calm of surrender, but of certainty. She clutched a small wooden cross, fashioned by a soldier who pitied her. The flames began to climb, and still she did not flinch. The crowd grew quieter. Some say she called out to Jesus. Others swear she whispered to the voices only she could hear. How did it come to this? How did a girl from a forgotten village, who could neither read nor write, become the spark that threatened an empire? How did a child who spoke of saints and salvation end up condemned as a witch? To understand the fire that consumed Joan, we must go back to a France torn apart, to a girl who believed she was chosen, and to the men who feared her more than they feared God. She was not born to burn, she was born to listen. In the quiet fields of Domrémy, a small village in eastern France, Joan grew up surrounded by sheep, silence, and war. It was 1412, and France was bleeding. The 100 Years' War had carved the country into factions, with the English claiming the throne and the French crown prince, Charles, dismissed as a weakling. Joan was no one. A peasant girl, the daughter of farmers, raised in a world where survival meant keeping your head down. But Joan was different. At 13, she began to hear voices, not the whispers of doubt or madness, but clear, radiant voices. Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret. They told her she was chosen to save France, chosen to crown a king. She didn't question them. She didn't run. She knelt in the fields, her hands in the dirt, and said yes to a destiny no one else could see. Her family thought her strange but harmless. The villagers called her pious, perhaps touched by God. But Joan's faith wasn't quiet or meek. It was a fire in her chest, a certainty that pushed her beyond the boundaries of her world. By 17, she left home, dressed in men's clothing, and walked into a war she was never meant to survive. She arrived at the court of Charles, the uncrowned king, in 1429. The nobles laughed at her, a girl in armor, claiming divine orders. But Charles, desperate and superstitious, listened. Joan's words were not soft or diplomatic. She spoke with the blunt force of truth, telling him to trust her, to let her lead. And when she took up a banner, not a sword, and rode to Orléans, something impossible happened. The city, under siege for months, was freed. The English fled. The girl who heard voices had turned the tide of a war. Her victories piled up. Patay, Troyes, Reims. She stood beside Charles as he was crowned king in Reims Cathedral, her banner held high. The crowd wept. The nobles whispered. A peasant girl had done what armies could not. They called her the Maid of Orléans, a savior sent by God. But saviors are dangerous. They don't just win battles. They threaten thrones, churches, and the fragile order of men. And so, the shadow began to grow. The English called her a witch. The French nobles, jealous of her influence, began to turn. Even Charles, the king she crowned, grew uneasy. Joan was no longer just a girl. She was a force, a symbol, a threat. And in 1430, at Compiègne, her enemies caught her. She was betrayed, sold to the English for 10,000 gold coins. The voices had led her to glory. Now they led her to a cell. The cell was cold, damp, a stone cage in Rouen. Joan was no longer a warrior. She was a prisoner, chained, mocked, and questioned day after day. The men who judged her were not soldiers but priests, scholars, and bishops, men of God who served the English crown. They called it a trial, but it was a performance. 70 charges were read: heresy, witchcraft, wearing men's clothing. Her voices, she said, came from God. They called them demons. She was 19, alone, uneducated, facing a room of learned men, yet she did not break. When they asked if she feared damnation, she answered, "I know I am in God's grace." When they demanded she deny her voices, she refused. Her courage was not loud or defiant. It was quiet, unshakable, like a stone in a river. The judges grew frustrated. A girl was outwitting them. A peasant was defying their power. Outside, the English tightened their grip. They wanted her dead, not just to end her, but to erase her. A living Joan inspired armies. A dead Joan could be forgotten. But the church needed a confession, a public recantation to prove her voices were lies. They offered her life in prison if she would renounce her mission. For a moment she wavered, exhausted, afraid. She signed a paper, agreeing to submit. The crowd cheered, the judges smiled, but Joan was not made for cages. Days later, she recanted her recantation. She put on men's clothing again, defying their rules. She said the voices had spoken, that she had betrayed them by signing. The judges were done. On May 29, 1431, they declared her a relapsed heretic. The sentence was death. She knew what was coming. The night before, she prayed, not for escape, but for strength. The voices, she said, were still with her. They promised her soul would live, even if her body burned. The bishops left her cell, their robes sweeping the stone floor. The executioner was already preparing the stake. The morning of May 30 was gray, the air heavy with the threat of rain. Joan was led through the streets of Rouen, her hands bound, her face pale but steady. The crowd was larger now, some shouting curses, others weeping silently. The stake stood in the marketplace, surrounded by wood and straw. The executioner, a man named Geoffroy Terrage, hesitated. Even he, hardened by his trade, felt the weight of what was to come. Joan asked for a cross. A soldier broke a stick and tied it into one, pressing it into her hands. She kissed it, her lips trembling, but her eyes dry. The executioner tied her to the stake. The paper crown was placed on her head. A cruel jest. The crowd grew still. The fire was lit. The flames rose slowly at first, curling around the wood like fingers. Joan's voice broke the silence, calling out to Jesus, to her saints. The fire climbed higher, and the heat began to sear. She did not scream, she did not beg. Some in the crowd turned away, unable to watch. Others say they saw her lips move, her eyes fixed on the sky, as if the voices were there, guiding her through the pain. The fire consumed her. Her body, small and frail, disappeared into the flames. The executioner later swore he could not burn her heart. It remained whole, untouched by the fire. The crowd dispersed, some in awe, some in fear. The English soldiers stood guard, ensuring no relics were taken. But they could not guard her story. The marketplace was empty by dusk. The ashes were swept into the Seine, as if to erase her. But whispers spread. The girl who burned was no witch. She was a martyr. The English had won the day, but their victory was hollow. Charles the King she crowned did nothing to save her. He ruled, but his crown felt heavier now. The church, complicit in her death, would later declare her trial unjust. In the years that followed, France rallied. Joan's name became a cry, a spark that lit new battles. By 1453, the English were driven from French soil. The 100 Years' War ended, not with armies, but with the memory of a girl who believed. In 1456, the church annulled her conviction, calling her innocent. In 1920, she was canonized as a saint. Her voices, dismissed as madness, outlived the flames. Her story, carried by soldiers, peasants, and poets, became a legend. She was not just a girl, not just a warrior. She was a warning. When you challenge the powerful with nothing but faith, they will try to break you. But break you, and they make you eternal. Joan of Arc burned for her faith, and in that fire, she became immortal.